December 19, 1944, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, as if time itself were hesitating. Across a shallow ridge north of Stavelot, a single 105mm howitzer squatted in a nest of pine and mud. It wasn't supposed to be there, neither was its gunner. The forest held its breath. In the valley below, tracks ground against frozen soil. Somewhere beyond the tree line, engines growled in formation, the sound of steel organized for war. For 3 days, the U.S. lines had been buckling under the sudden, brutal offensive of Battle of the Bulge. The German armor, a spearhead of 6th Panzer Army, had pushed through the Ardennes like a hammer through snow glass. Towns that had been quiet only a week earlier now burned in the night, their rooftops lit orange against a sky too cold for mercy. And above them on the ridge was Sergeant Edward "Eddie" Marshall, a gunner who wasn't on any official line of fire that morning. The order had been simple: pull back the artillery battery towards Spa, fall behind defensive lines, and regroup. But Eddie didn't move. He had already seen what happened when artillery retreated too soon. The panzers came faster than expected. Communications faltered, roadblocks folded, and columns of steel rolled through broken positions like they weren't even there. He had stood at Malmedy 2 days earlier and watched the smoke rise where retreating Americans had been caught in the open. That image had burned itself into him like a live round in the chamber. So he stayed. The gun, a battle-scarred 105mm M2A1 howitzer, was dug into the earth like an animal refusing to die. Snow crusted its barrel. The crew was gone. Only Eddie remained, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled like cordite and frost, listening to the distant clatter of treads. Every officer he'd ever had would have told him this was suicide, but Eddie wasn't listening to officers anymore. Down in the valley, 32 German vehicles crawled forward in disciplined formation. A column of Panzer foes and half-tracks from the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, SS Adolf Hitler, moved under a veil of snow fog, their black crosses blending with the skeletal pines. They were headed for the vital bridge at Stavelot, and if they took it, the road to Spa and the American rear would be wide open. Eddie was one man against a column. His howitzer had 14 shells left. No forward observer. No fire mission authorization. No support on either flank. But he had something else. A firing pattern he'd memorized against orders. Weeks earlier, Eddie had been reprimanded for experimenting with indirect salvo staggering, a method that involved rapid offsetting of shell impact zones to simulate multiple batteries. The brass had called it reckless. He'd called it insurance. Now, in the forest silence, that defiance was about to be tested. The German column rolled closer, their engines drowning out the wind. Frost snapped on bare branches like distant gunfire. Eddie tightened his gloves. He could almost feel the treads now, the vibration crawling through the frozen soil like a living thing. First range estimate 1,200 meters, elevation set. Fuse cut to delay. He exhaled through his teeth and did what no one had ordered him to do. The first round cracked into the white sky. The 105mm barked with a sound that seemed to split the stillness in half. A second later, an explosion ripped through the lead half-track, lifting its front axle clean off the road. Smoke erupted in a violent bloom. The German column halted, engines rumbling in confusion. Eddie's next round landed 30 meters behind the second vehicle, a deliberate offset. Another followed to the left tree line, another to the right. Within 20 seconds, he had created the illusion of multiple guns firing from hidden positions across the ridge. The panzers stalled, turning their turrets toward phantoms that didn't exist. But Eddie didn't know how long the deception would last. Snow muffled everything except the rising growl of the column. He could hear shouted German commands echoing through the forest like wolves. Black uniformed figures dismounted, moving low and fast. Their breath clouded in the cold. Eddie's breath did too. For a moment it felt like the whole war had shrunk to the size of one ridge, one gun, one heartbeat. Then came the unmistakable metallic click of turret rotation. The lead panzer was hunting. Eddie's hand hovered above the firing lanyard. He was no longer following orders. He was making history. The howitzer thundered again. That breath, the one caught in the turret, finally released when the shell came. The second detonation struck the road just beneath the lead Panzer IV, kicking up a geyser of snow, gravel, and iron. The German tank lurched, its treads biting air as the front end slammed down hard, metal screaming against rock. Behind it, the entire column braked in a sudden, discordant roar. Within seconds, the frozen valley that had seemed so silent now throbbed with mechanical panic. Eddie Marshall kept firing. His world was no longer made of maps or orders. It was the rhythm of his hands and the shudder of the howitzer against the earth. Each shot landed not where the enemy was, but where they would look if they believed an entire artillery battery was waiting in the trees. Every impact bloomed in a different place, carefully spaced to mimic multiple guns. The Germans fanned out, scanning tree lines that held no men. It was deception wrapped in thunder. The valley filled with smoke. It didn't rise cleanly. It bled into the fog like bruises spreading through the cold air. The German infantry dismounted quickly, snow spraying from their boots as they fanned out along the column's flanks. Their black silhouettes disappeared and reappeared like wraiths between trees. Eddie's heart pounded against the inside of his chest, but his mind was frighteningly still. He had trained for precision, but what he was doing now was something else entirely. Improvisation with everything on the line. Down below, the 1st Panzer's turret finally found him. It swung toward the ridge with chilling slowness, its gun like a finger pointing straight at his heart. The engine growled, then steadied. The Germans didn't know if they were facing a battery or a lone madman. They wouldn't know until they fired. Eddie adjusted the elevation one more notch, then yanked the lanyard. The shell screamed overhead, curved and landed short of the tank, right in front of the muzzle. A column of white snow and brown dirt erupted, blinding their sight line. He hadn't destroyed it, but he had bought seconds. Seconds were gold here. The forest exploded with echoes. For a moment it sounded like a battlefield far larger than it was. Somewhere in the column, a German officer barked commands through the static of the winter air. Vehicles began trying to pivot off the road, their treads slipping on packed snow. A half-track reversed into another vehicle with a metallic crunch. Coordination faltered. What had been a precise armored spear began to resemble a coiled, confused machine. Eddie's battery was winning a fight it didn't exist in. But deception has limits. A shell casing rolled down the frozen earth beside him, clinking faintly. He had fired 5 of his 14 rounds. Each one narrowed the future. Below, 2 German squads were already pushing toward the tree line, hugging the shallow embankments. They weren't waiting for orders anymore. They were hunting. Eddie wiped his brow with the back of a gloved hand, though the air was cold enough to burn skin. Then the sound he feared most cut through the valley, the deep mechanical cough of a main gun. The Panzer had fired. The shell slammed into the far edge of the ridge, tearing through soil and snow like a knife through paper. Fragments of earth rained down around the gun pit. Eddie didn't flinch. He could not afford to. He shifted the howitzer AS carriage a few degrees right and fired again. Not at the lead tank this time, but at the rear. The explosion tore through a half-track, flipping it sideways and blocking the only exit down the narrow road. Panic moved like fire through the German line. In armored columns, retreat is geometry. If the lead can't move forward and the rear is cut off, the column becomes a steel trap. Eddie had just sprung it. The valley, once an open artery of attack, was now a bleeding wound. Turrets swung without targets. German officers shouted into radios that weren't receiving, and above them, unseen in the smoke, one American gunner made their world collapse shell by shell. The infantry reached the lower slope of the ridge. Muzzle flashes erupted like flares against the snow. Bullets cut through branches overhead. Splinters stung Eddie's cheek. He ducked low, pulling the breech lever with practiced hands. He didn't need to see them to know how close they were. The howitzer barked again, and another explosion chewed a crater in the middle of the road. A second half-track burst into flames, its ammunition cooking off in bursts that cracked like broken bones. But the panzers were adapting. 2 of them were breaking from the main road, attempting to flank along the tree line. Their treads crushed saplings like matchsticks. They would have his position soon. Eddie looked at the ammo crate beside him. 7 shells left. No radio, no reinforcements, just the rhythm of steel and winter. Snow whipped across the ridge as the wind picked up, howling between the pines like the forest itself had chosen a side. Eddie leaned into the gun again, eyes narrowing against the cold. Down below, the tanks were moving like predators circling prey. The deception had worked, but now the hunt had begun. He pulled the lanyard one more time. The valley answered with fire. The ground shook. The Germans roared, and the ridge burned with the echo of one man's defiance. The third shell, in under a minute, cracked through the fog like a hammer-splitting glass. The echo rolled down the valley, reverberating against the black pines. Below the ridge, the German column was no longer a column at all. It was a fracture. Burning vehicles spat black smoke into the white winter air, staining it like ink in water. The lead Panzer IV sat crippled, its crew scrambling for cover. At the rear, a half-track burned like a bonfire, its munitions still popping in erratic bursts. The snow around it glowed orange, a hellish stain in an otherwise silent forest. Eddie Marshall crouched low in the gun pit, chest heaving. The heat from the howitzer mixed with the freezing air, creating thin white plumes around him with each breath. His gloves were stiff with frozen sweat, his fingertips numb but steady. He had 6 shells left. Somewhere in the smoke below, 2 panzers had peeled away from the road, flanking along the tree line like predators closing in from both sides. It was no longer a standoff. It was a tightening circle. The infantry moved first. 2 squads of black-coated soldiers from the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, SS, Adolf Hitler, fanned out across the slope, using the trunks of fir trees as cover. Eddie could see flashes of movement, the glint of a helmet, the pulse of muzzle flashes, then nothing. Bullets snapped through branches above him, showering the pit with bark and snow. He pressed his shoulder against the frozen earth wall, steadying his breathing. They didn't know how many guns were up here. Not yet. Another shot roared from below. A German tank shell slammed into the near side of the ridge, tearing up a curtain of dirt and stone. Eddie ducked as shards rained down on the howitzer. One chunk of rock glanced off the breech guard, ringing like a dull bell. The tank's aim was getting closer. He swung the barrel slightly left, dialing the elevation down just a hair. This one wasn't aimed for show. It was a trap. He fired. The shell arced through the fog, disappearing into the white void. A heartbeat later, an explosion ripped through the tree line on the flank. One of the panzers shuddered, its flank caught by the blast. It didn't kill it, but it did what Eddie needed most. It stunned it. The great machine coughed smoke and lurched to the side, its momentum broken. Snow cascaded off its turret like ash falling from a giant's shoulder. The infantry responded in kind. Grenades bloomed along the slope in shallow bursts, throwing snow and splinters into the air. Eddie threw himself flat against the frozen ground, the shockwaves thudding through his ribs. He felt the vibration of boots now. They were climbing. 5 shells left. The enemy wasn't just pushing anymore. They were closing the distance. The forest around the ridge began to change character. The quiet, muffled calm of winter was replaced by a rising, mechanical growl. The second flanking tank roared to life at full throttle, its treads ripping through the underbrush like a steel avalanche. Eddie could see its silhouette now. Low, broad, unstoppable, advancing through the smoke. He'd broken their formation, but he hadn't broken their will. They were hunting him now with anger. He loaded another round, the casing biting into his gloves like frozen iron. He adjusted for the tank's speed, compensating for its angle. When he pulled the lanyard, the recoil nearly threw him back. The shell screamed across the valley and detonated just ahead of the panzer, blowing a crater into its path. Snow and dirt cascaded over the hull, slowing it for only a breath. But in battle, a breath can be a lifetime. Then came the sound he'd been dreading, a sharp metallic shriek. A tank shell punched into the top edge of the ridge. The impact cracked through the pit like thunder, collapsing a section of his earthen wall. Dirt and snow poured in. Eddie's ears rang, a thin whistle cutting through the chaos. His vision swam for a second. He blinked hard, forcing the world back into focus. 4 shells left. Below, German infantry were now at 50 meters. They were moving between trees like black water. Their shouts were close, too close. Eddie could hear the distinct clink of grenades on belts, the crunch of boots in snow, the short bursts of MP40s. They were going to storm the ridge. If they got close enough, the gun wouldn't matter anymore. The battle would end in seconds. He looked at the last 4 shells and made a decision. 2 would be used to keep the tanks at bay. 1 would block the road completely, and 1 would be saved for the moment when the ridge itself needed to disappear in fire. The cold logic of war had stripped everything else away. Eddie hauled the next shell into the breach, the movement smooth, mechanical. He had trained for this moment without ever knowing it. Below, the 1st Panzer was moving again, turret turning toward him like the slow blink of a predator. Smoke and snow twisted around its barrel. Eddie exhaled. He didn't think about survival anymore. He thought about timing. He pulled the lanyard. The shell struck the road at the midpoint of the column, detonating beneath another half-track. The explosion split the snow with orange light. The vehicle erupted like a lung collapsing. Fire and twisted steel rained down onto the valley floor, cutting the German formation clean in half. Panic spread again. Officers shouted over one another. Radios squawked into the void, but the Germans were still coming. Snow whipped sideways as the wind rose, howling between the pines. Smoke swirled into the white sky. Eddie knelt behind his howitzer, a lone figure against a world of steel. The ridge, once a quiet patch of snow, was now a bleeding wound on the map of Europe. And down in that wound the hunters were climbing. The wind roared across the ridge like a living thing. Smoke hung low, twisting in the dark air, staining the snow in swirls of gray and ash. The German column below was no longer a spear, but a scattered wound, broken in half, burning at both ends. Yet the danger was closer than ever. The enemy had crawled up the slope like a black tide, and the tanks were circling like wolves that had learned the shape of their prey. Eddie Marshall's world had narrowed to the size of his gun pit. 4 shells and a final line of frost-bitten earth. The 1st Panzer broke through the tree line to the left, its turret swinging as it climbed over the soft snow. The groan of its engine rolled through the forest like thunder. Eddie aimed not for the tank itself, but for the earth beneath it. He pulled the lanyard. The 105mm howitzer screamed. The shell hit just ahead of the advancing machine, ripping a crater into the slope. The Panzer's front end dipped hard, treads grinding into the pit. For a moment it shuddered, caught in its own momentum, its turret turning in blind fury. Eddie didn't wait to admire it. He was already loading again. On the right flank, the 2nd Panzer advanced more cautiously, its commander having learned from the 1st. Its hull moved through the smoke like a shape out of a nightmare. Deliberate, heavy, precise. Eddie fired his next round directly at its path, aiming not for a kill but to scatter the infantry moving beside it. The blast sent men sprawling, their black coats vanishing in a spray of white powder and orange flame. 2 shells left. The infantry were close now, so close he could hear them shouting in German through the storm, their voices sharpened by desperation. MP40 fire ripped through the tree line, spitting bursts into the gun pit. Bark exploded from trees. A splinter tore across Eddie's sleeve, stinging like a hot blade. He dropped low behind the breech of the gun, heart hammering against the frozen ground. The ridge was no longer a position. It was a knife's edge. The lead Panzer tried to climb out of the crater. Its engine roared, metal straining under its own weight. Snow and mud churned beneath its treads. Eddie loaded his 13th shell. There was no time to think. no time to breathe. He fired point-blank into the earth beneath it. The explosion tore through the undercarriage, blowing its left tread clean off. The tank lurched sideways, half buried in its own crater, its turrets spinning without aim. A guttural metallic groan echoed through the valley. A dying beast in the snow. One shell remained. The last act of a one-man war. The German infantry stormed the ridge. Black figures burst from the smoke, weapons raised, boots pounding through the snow. Eddie could see their faces now, pale and determined, cheeks red from the cold. Grenades clinked on their belts, rifles leveled at the pit. This was the end of the deception. The moment when the line would either hold or die. Eddie reached for the final shell. He wasn't going to fire it down the valley. He was going to fire it into the ridge itself. He had planned this from the moment he saw them coming. If they took the position, they'd take the gun. If they took the gun, they'd have the bridge. He lifted the shell with trembling, frozen hands and slid it into the breach with slow, deliberate care. Every movement felt like it was happening underwater. The cold had sunk into his bones. The world outside the pit blurred into smoke, fire, and moving shadows. The Germans opened fire. Bullets ripped across the pit, striking the shield of the howitzer, kicking up bursts of snow and steel. One round tore through his shoulder, spinning him sideways. Eddie gasped, pain flaring hot and bright against the freezing air. But his hand didn't leave the lanyard. It never would. He dragged himself upright, pressed his boot against the trail of the gun, and stared down at the valley below. At the bridge, at the burning vehicles, at the column that would never reach its objective. He pulled the lanyard. The ridge disappeared in a flash of white fire. The explosion ripped through the earth like a heartbeat made of thunder. The gun pit became a storm of soil and steel, swallowing the advancing infantry and the last tank in one blinding detonation. Shockwaves rolled through the valley, bouncing off the frozen trees in waves of smoke. Snow fell again in heavy silence, coating everything in a soft, cold shroud. The howitzer was gone. The ridge was gone. But so was the column. Hours later, when elements of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division pushed toward Stavelot, they found the road littered with burning armor and twisted tracks. A single ridge stood blackened and quiet. There was no artillery crew, no forward observer, only the remains of a gun that had held its ground longer than anyone had a right to. The Germans never crossed that bridge. Eddie Marshall's name never made the official dispatch that night. His firing pattern had been unauthorized. His position had been abandoned by command. But what he did on that ridge carved itself into the winter of 1944 like a scar no one could erase. One gun, 14 shells, and a decision no one else would have made had stopped an armored column of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler dead in its tracks. Snow kept falling. The forest was silent again. But beneath it, history still trembled.